The morning fog rolled across Naval Base Coronado like a gray curtain hiding secrets, and Lieutenant Sarah Storm Martinez preferred it that way. She stepped off the transport bus at 0547 hours, her single duffel bag slung over one shoulder with practiced ease. At first glance, she looked like any other transfer regulation haircut. Standard issue utilities, the slightly overwhelmed expression of someone adjusting to a new assignment. But Sarah Martinez had perfected the art of being underestimated. And today, that skill would serve a purpose far more critical than any mission she'd completed in the mountains of Afghanistan or the waters off Somalia. A base was already alive with morning activity. Recruits jogged past in formation, their synchronized footfalls creating a rhythmic drumbeat on the asphalt. Instructors barked orders that echoed across the parade grounds. The familiar sounds of military life surrounded Sarah like a comfortable blanket, even as she forced herself to move with less confidence than she'd shown since she was 18 years old. Martinez? A gravelly voice cut through the morning air. Commander Robert. Hayes approached from the administration building, his weathered face telling the story of 30 years in naval service. Salt spray and hard decisions had carved lines around his eyes, and his stride carried the authority of a man who'd never backed down from a fight. But today, as he looked at the woman walking toward him, uncertainty flickered across his features. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, snapping to attention with textbook precision. Hayes studied her for a long moment, his eyes taking in every detail. "You're smaller than I expected." Sarah had heard those words countless times throughout her career. In Bud S training, when instructors had looked at her 5 feet 6 inches frame and wondered if she could carry a 200-pound teammate to safety. During her first deployment, when special operations commanders had questioned whether she could handle the physical demands of deep reconnaissance missions. And later, when she'd stood before the selection board for Naval Special Warfare Development Group, the most elite unit in the world's most elite military. Every time, she'd proven them wrong. "I get that a lot, sir," she said with a slight smile that didn't reach her eyes. They began walking toward the administration building, and Hayes lowered his voice to barely above a whisper. "What I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this conversation. We've got a cancer growing in class 387, and it's been spreading for months. 3 female recruits have filed formal complaints in the past 30 days alone. Sexual harassment, physical intimidation, threats of violence. Every time we launch an investigation, witnesses suddenly develop amnesia, and evidence has a way of disappearing." Sarah's trained eyes swept the base as they walked, automatically cataloging entry points, security positions, and potential threats. Old habits from a dozen classified missions, where situational awareness meant the difference between completing the objective and coming home in a body bag. But today, the enemy wore the same uniform she did. "Chain of command?" she asked quietly. "Clean, as far as we can tell. This is coming from within the recruit ranks, but it's sophisticated, organized. They know how to avoid cameras, when to strike, how to intimidate victims into silence." Hayes handed her a manila folder marked with security classifications that would have impressed most personnel. "Your primary target is recruit Marcus Peterson. 6'2", former college football player, thinks his daddy's connections make him bulletproof. 4 followers who'd walk through fire if he told them it would make them look tough." As they passed the main training facility, Sarah caught sight of the problem immediately. 5 recruits clustered near a bulletin board, but they weren't reading announcements. Peterson, she recognized him from his file photo, had a smaller recruit in what appeared to be a friendly demonstration of a chokehold. But Sarah could see the smaller man's feet barely touching the ground, his face reddening as he struggled for air, while the other 4 laughed. The scene lasted exactly 12 seconds before an instructor rounded the corner. Instantly, Peterson released his victim, and the group scattered, all innocent smiles and casual conversation. The smaller recruit stumbled away, rubbing his neck and casting fearful glances over his shoulder. Textbook predator behavior, Sarah murmured. Exactly. They test boundaries, establish dominance, then escalate when they think they're safe. Hayes led her into the building, past walls lined with portraits of naval heroes who'd shaped American history. Your cover identity is Lieutenant Sarah Martinez Note, the single logistics officer fresh from a desk job in Norfolk. Nervous. Inexperienced. Exactly the kind of target they've been selecting. Sarah opened the file and studied the fabricated service record that had been carefully constructed over the past week. Paper trails showing a mediocre officer who'd requested transfer to escape the tedium of supply coordination. Performance reviews that suggested competence but no particular strengths. A psychological profile that painted her as eager to please, but lacking in confidence. The beauty of this cover, Hayes continued, is that it's partially true. You did serve in logistics before your SEAL training. Most people don't know that's often where we find our best special operations candidates. The attention to detail, the ability to think 3 steps ahead, the understanding that small failures can have catastrophic consequences. They reached Hayes's office, and he closed the door before continuing. But here's what makes you perfect for this mission, Lieutenant. You've spent the last 8 years learning to be invisible when you need to be. To blend into any environment, assume any identity, become whoever the mission requires. Today, we need you to become prey. Sarah set down her duffel bag and straightened her shoulders. How long do I have? Intelligence suggests they're escalating. The last victim was hospitalized after what they called a training accident. If we don't stop this now, someone's going to get seriously hurt, or worse. Hayes moved to his window, looking out at the recruits beginning their morning training routine. The problem is, they're smart. They've learned to operate in the spaces between official oversight. But they haven't learned that sometimes the Navy puts wolves in sheep's clothing. Sarah nodded, already beginning the mental transformation. That would turn one of America's most elite warriors into an apparently helpless target. When do I start? You already have. As of this moment, Lieutenant Sarah Martinez doesn't exist. You're Sarah Martinez, and you're about to discover just how dangerous it can be to look vulnerable in a world full of predators. Hayes handed her a key card and a set of temporary quarters assignments. But remember, they don't know what they're hunting, and that's going to be their biggest mistake. As Sarah left the administration building, she caught one final glimpse of Peterson's crew. They were watching a group of female recruits with the focused intensity of hunters selecting their next target. One of the women, barely 19 years old, stumbled under the weight of her equipment pack. Peterson nudged Rodriguez and pointed in her direction, both men grinning with cruel anticipation. Sarah felt the familiar cold anger that had carried her through the most dangerous missions of her career. But this time, the enemy wouldn't see her coming until it was far too late. The hunt was about to begin. The base mess hall at 1200 hours was a carefully orchestrated symphony of controlled chaos. Sarah Martinez, now Sarah, she reminded herself, stood at the entrance for exactly 3 seconds longer than necessary, letting her eyes dart nervously across the crowded room like a deer sensing predators. The performance had to be perfect from the very first moment, because she knew they were already watching. She clutched her meal tray with both hands, knuckles slightly white from the grip, shoulders hunched just enough to suggest someone trying to make herself smaller. It was a masterclass in body language manipulation, every gesture calculated to project vulnerability, while her trained mind cataloged every detail of the tactical environment around her. The mess hall buzzed with the familiar sounds of military. Mealtime, silverware clattering against metal trays, conversations competing for airspace, the occasional bark of laughter from groups of personnel, bonding over shared misery and triumph. But underneath the surface normalcy, Sarah detected the subtle currents of tension that always existed when predators and prey occupied the same space. She selected a corner table with deliberate hesitation, appearing to seek isolation while actually positioning herself with perfect sightlines to her primary targets. Peterson and his crew commanded the center of the room like apex predators holding court, their voices carrying over the general din with the confidence of those who believe themselves untouchable. Double quotes, ... So there I am, 50 feet underwater in the combat training tank. Peterson's voice boomed across 3 tables. And this instructor thinks he's going to break me with some basic breath hold exercise. I looked that squid right in the eye and said, "Sir, you're going to need more than that to rattle Marcus Peterson." The 4 other recruits laughed on cue, but Sarah noticed the artificial quality of their amusement. Rodriguez's laugh was sharp and predatory, his eyes constantly scanning for reactions from nearby tables. Jenkins seemed nervous even while enjoying the story, his fingers drumming anxiously against his tray. Thompson simply nodded along, the muscle of the group who spoke little but intimidated much through his sheer physical presence. Carter appeared bored, more interested in his phone than Peterson's boasting, which suggested either genuine disinterest or careful calculation. Sarah took careful note of each personality type. In her experience, group dynamics like this followed predictable patterns. Peterson was the classic alpha, requiring constant validation through dominance displays. Rodriguez was the true sadist, the one who would escalate situations for personal pleasure. Jenkins was the follower, dangerous because he would do anything to maintain acceptance. Thompson was the enforcer, probably uncomfortable with the psychological games, but willing to use violence when directed. Carter was the wild card, either the smartest of the group or potentially the most dangerous because his motivations were unclear. "Hey, Rodriguez." Thompson nodded in Sarah's direction with the subtlety of a freight train. "New girl's been watching us all week." Sarah's heart rate remained steady. Years of training had taught her to control involuntary responses, but she allowed a flush to creep up her neck as she quickly looked down at her food. The movement was perfectly timed, obvious enough to be noticed, but not so dramatic as to appear staged. "Maybe she likes what she sees." Peterson grinned, his voice carrying just far enough for her to hear. Fresh meat's always curious about the real operators. Rodriguez leaned forward with interest, his dead eyes focusing on Sarah with the intensity of a shark detecting blood in the water. Look at her trying to disappear into that corner. Probably never seen real Navy personnel before, just supply clerks and paper pushers. Sarah forced herself to take small bites of food while straining to hear their conversation. Every word was evidence, every gesture a piece of the pattern she was building for the eventual prosecution. But more than that, she was learning their hunting methodology, understanding how they selected and approached their victims. "Should we go introduce ourselves?" Jenkins suggested, and Sarah caught the eager undertone in his voice. This wasn't his first time participating in this particular game. "Nah, let her stew for a while," Rodriguez replied with calculated cruelty. "Fear makes him more ... cooperative. Trust me, by the time we make our move, she'll be so grateful for the attention, she won't even think about saying no." The casual way he said it, the implication that consent was never part of the equation made Sarah's jaw clench involuntarily. She covered the reaction by taking a sip of water, but inside, the cold fury that had carried her through the most dangerous missions of her career began to build. These weren't just bullies or overgrown frat boys playing pranks. They were predators with a systematic approach to victimization. Thompson chuckled, a sound like gravel in a cement mixer. "Remember that logistics girl from last month? Started crying before we even said anything to her." Peterson barely had to raise his voice. "Different girl, different approach," Peterson replied with the air of someone who'd given this considerable thought. This one's trying to be invisible, which means she's probably got some fight in her. We'll need to be more persuasive. Sarah noticed how other personnel gave their table a wide berth, conversations quieting as people passed nearby. The toxic influence of Peterson's crew extended far beyond their immediate victims, created an atmosphere of fear that affected everyone in their vicinity. It was a classic intimidation tactic, establishing territorial dominance through the implied threat of violence. "Look at her," Carter finally spoke up, glancing at Sarah over his phone screen. "Eating alone every day, never talks to anyone, always looks like she's about to bolt. Either she's hiding from something, or she's exactly what she appears to be, another scared little transfer who doesn't know how things work around here." The analysis was uncomfortably accurate, which suggested Carter was more observant than his bored demeanor indicated. Sarah filed that information away as she finished her meal. In her experience, the quiet ones were often the most dangerous, because they were thinking while everyone else was talking. She stood to leave, deliberately fumbling with her tray and allowing one utensil to clatter to the floor. As she bent to retrieve it, she stumbled slightly, just enough to catch their attention without appearing completely incompetent. Their laughter followed her as she made her way to the disposal area, the sound cutting through the mess hall noise like a blade. "See you around, Sarah," Peterson called out, using her first name with casual familiarity that suggested he'd already been researching her background. The message was clear. "We know who you are, we know where to find you, and we're watching." Sarah managed a small wave that appeared more nervous than friendly before hurrying toward the exit. But as she reached the door, she allowed herself one quick glance back. All 5 of them were still watching her, their expressions ranging from amused to calculating to hungry. Phase 1 of the operation was complete. She had their attention, she'd established her cover identity, and she'd begun documenting their behavioral patterns. But more importantly, she'd seen the predatory gleam in their eyes that confirmed everything Commander Hayes had told her about the threat they represented. As she stepped out into the California sunshine, Sarah allowed herself a cold smile that never would have appeared on Sarah Martinez's face. They thought they'd found their next victim, but what they'd actually done was paint a target on themselves for one of the most dangerous operators in the United States military. The hunters had no idea they were about to become the hunted. By the end of her first week at Naval Base Coronado, Sarah Martinez had become the perfect victim. It was a role that required every ounce of acting ability Sarah had developed during 8 years of deep cover operations, because everything about it went against her nature. Where her instincts screamed to stand tall and meet challenges head-on, she forced herself to hunch her shoulders and avoid eye contact. Where years of training had taught her to move with lethal precision, she now stumbled and fumbled with calculated clumsiness. The transformation was so complete that even seasoned personnel began treating her with the casual dismissiveness reserved for obvious failures. But Sarah knew that every dropped file, every nervous stammer, every moment of apparent incompetence was building toward something larger. She was constructing a trap with herself as bait, and Peterson's crew was taking it piece by piece. Tuesday morning provided the perfect opportunity for her next performance. She'd timed her arrival at the supply depot to coincide with Peterson's scheduled equipment inspection, carrying a precariously balanced stack of requisition forms that she'd deliberately loosened from their clips. The inevitable collision occurred exactly as planned when she rounded the corner near their usual congregation point. Papers exploded across the corridor in a cascade of bureaucratic chaos. Sarah dropped to her knees immediately, frantically, trying to gather the scattered documents while maintaining the panicked expression of someone whose career was flashing before her eyes. The performance was so convincing that 2 passing petty officers actually stopped to help before noticing. Peterson's crew watching with obvious amusement. Jesus Martinez. Peterson's voice carried the perfect blend of condescension and false concern as he approached. You always this clumsy. Or are we just witnessing something special? Sarah looked up from the floor, her face flushed with apparent embarrassment and genuine strain from maintaining such an unnatural posture. Sorry. I'm still getting used to everything here. It's so different from Norfolk. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, a detail that made Rodriguez's eyes light up with predatory interest. Norfolk? Jenkins perked up, moving closer with the eagerness of a hunting dog catching a scent. You were stuck behind a desk pushing papers your whole career? Sarah nodded, struggling to her feet while clutching the disorganized stack of forms. Supply coordination and logistics. Management. I requested the transfer because I wanted some real Navy experience, but everything here moves so fast, and everyone seems to know exactly what they're doing except me. The confession was perfectly crafted, enough truth to be believable, enough vulnerability to be irresistible to predators who fed on insecurity and fear. Sarah had studied the psychological profiles of serial offenders during her intelligence training, and she recognized the pattern playing out in Peterson's expression as he processed her words. Real Navy experience, huh? Peterson stepped closer, invading her personal space with the casual entitlement of someone who'd never been challenged. Maybe we could teach you a thing or two about how things really work around here. Show you what it means to be part of a real team. Thompson cracked his knuckles behind Peterson, the sound echoing off the corridor walls like a threat made audible. Rodriguez circled to Sarah's left side, cutting off one potential escape route while Carter positioned himself near the stairwell. It was textbook pack behavior, and they executed it with the unconscious coordination of predators who'd hunted together many times before. That's very kind of you, Sarah managed, backing against the wall with apparent nervousness while actually positioning herself to observe all 5 men simultaneously. But I wouldn't want to be any trouble. I know you all have important training to focus on. No trouble at all. Rodriguez's voice carried an undertone that made several passing personnel quicken their pace. We take special care of newbies around here, especially the ones who seem a little lost. His emphasis on the last word was deliberate, designed to reinforce her isolation while establishing their role as potential protectors. It was a classic manipulation technique: create dependency by highlighting vulnerability, then offer protection that came with unspoken conditions. Sarah let her breathing become slightly more rapid, her eyes darting between the 5 men with a desperate calculation of prey looking for escape routes. I should really get back to work. Commander Hayes is expecting these requisitions by 1400 hours, and if I'm late again, Hayes can wait. Peterson's voice carried the unmistakable tone of command, and Sarah noticed how the other 4 automatically deferred to his authority. We're trying to help you here, Martinez. Show you how to navigate the real chain of command. Jenkins held up his phone, ostensibly checking the time, but actually positioning it for a potential recording. Sarah had noticed this behavior before modern. Predators often documented their activities, whether for blackmail purposes or simply to relive the experience later. The casual nature of the gesture suggested this wasn't their first time, combining intimidation with digital evidence gathering. Here's what's going to happen, Peterson continued, moving close enough that Sarah could smell the aggressive cologne. He used to mask his natural scent. You're going to meet us tonight at the old training facility near the pier. Building 47. It's not on the official base maps, but we'll make sure you find it. Consider it orientation for personnel who need to understand how things really work around here. The location choice was tactically significant. Building 47 was scheduled for demolition, which meant no security cameras, no regular patrols, and plenty of soundproofing from its original purpose as an engine testing facility. Sarah had reconnoitered the area 3 days earlier and found it perfect for the kind of activities that required absolute privacy. I don't know if I should ... Sarah's protest was deliberately weak, designed to invite pressure rather than discourage it. You should. Rodriguez leaned in from her left side, his breath hot against her ear. Unless you'd prefer we discuss your performance issues with Commander Hayes directly. Might be interesting to hear what he thinks about personnel who can't handle basic logistical responsibilities. The threat was implicit, but clear: comply with our demands or face professional consequences that could destroy your career. It was extortion wrapped in false concern, and Sarah recognized it as the same technique they probably used on their previous victims. Carter, who had remained silent throughout the encounter, finally spoke up. Building 47, 2,100 hours. Don't keep us waiting, Sarah. We don't like to repeat invitations. The use of her first name was another calculated violation of normal military protocol, designed to establish inappropriate intimacy while undermining her sense of professional identity. Every element of their approach showed sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation techniques. As they walked away, Sarah allowed herself to slump against the wall as if their departure had removed some invisible pressure. But inside, she was calculating angles, timing, and the exact sequence of actions she would need to take when the time came to drop her cover. She had 8 hours to prepare for a confrontation that would end either with justice served or with her own carefully constructed identity exposed. Either way, the game of cat and mouse was about to become something far more dangerous. That evening, as Sarah checked her equipment one final time, she reflected on the psychological cost of spending a week projecting weakness and fear. Every instinct screamed against the role she'd been playing. Every moment of apparent vulnerability went against 8 years of training that had forged her into one of the world's most elite warriors. But tomorrow, Sarah Martinez would disappear forever, and Lieutenant Sarah Storm Martinez would remind 5 predators why assuming weakness could be the last mistake they ever made. Friday evening descended over Naval Base Coronado with the kind of California twilight that painted everything in shades of gold and shadow. The mess hall buzzed with the amplified energy that always accompanied the start of weekend Liberty Voices. Louder, laughter more reckless, the rigid discipline of the week, slowly giving way to the promise of temporary freedom. Sarah Martinez entered at 1947 hours, exactly 13 minutes later than her established pattern, knowing that the deviation would be noticed and interpreted as nervousness about the evening's arranged meeting. She moved through the serving line with hands that trembled just enough to be visible, selecting food she had no intention of eating, while her trained eyes cataloged every detail of the tactical environment. The mess hall was fuller than usual, but she could already see the natural ebb and flow that would leave her isolated with her targets within the next 30 minutes. Peterson and his crew had claimed their usual territory at the center of the dining area, but tonight their body language was different, more predatory. Rodriguez kept making crude gestures at passing female personnel, his movements deliberately exaggerated to project dominance and create discomfort. Thompson had positioned himself to block one of the main pathways, forcing other diners to squeeze past him, while he made inappropriate comments about their appearance. Jenkins documented everything through his phone's camera, no longer bothering to disguise his recording activities. Carter remained the wild card, sitting slightly apart from the group with an expression that could have been boredom or calculation. Sarah had spent considerable time analyzing his behavioral patterns, and she'd concluded he was either the smartest member of the crew or potentially the most dangerous, because his motivations remained opaque. Sarah selected her usual corner table, but tonight the isolation felt more pronounced. The strategic positioning that had seemed protective during her first week now appeared trap-like, with limited escape routes and maximum exposure to her tormentor's attention. It was exactly the psychology they wanted to create, a gradual erosion of safe spaces until their target had nowhere left to retreat. The mess hall began its predictable evening emptying as personnel headed off base for weekend activities. Groups of sailors laughed their way toward the exit, their voices carrying the relief of those temporarily freed from military structure. Others gathered their gear for overnight liberty, their conversations focused on bars, beaches, and the kind of recreational activities that helped military personnel decompress from constant high-stress training. Within 20 minutes, the cavernous dining facility had transformed from crowded chaos to an echoing space occupied by only the most dedicated diners and those, like Sarah, who had reasons to remain behind. The acoustics changed dramatically as the crowd thinned, making every conversation audible across the room and creating the kind of exposed atmosphere that predators preferred for their final approach. Well, well, Peterson's voice cut through, the diminishing chatter like a blade designed for psychological warfare. Look who's eating all alone again. The 5 recruits approached her table with the coordinated movement of a wolf pack, their formation so practiced it appeared almost choreographed. Peterson took point, his confident stride announcing his role as alpha. Rodriguez flanked left, his dead eyes already undressing her with predatory calculation. Thompson moved to block her retreat, his massive frame casting a shadow over her table. Jenkins positioned himself to record while maintaining the appearance of casual conversation. Carter completed the encirclement, his apparent disinterest masking tactical positioning that cut off her remaining escape routes. You know, Sarah. Peterson slid into the seat directly across from her, using her first name with the intimate familiarity of someone who believed he owned her already. We've been talking about you? A lot. Sarah looked up from her untouched food, allowing genuine fear to flicker across her features. But underneath the performance, her combat-trained mind was calculating distances, analyzing threat levels, and preparing for the moment when Sarah Martinez would cease to exist. Rodriguez leaned in from her left side, his presence a violation of personal space that made her skin crawl. See, we think you've been having a really hard time adjusting to life here. All alone, no friends, struggling with even the simplest tasks. That's got to be rough on someone who's used to the safe little world of supply coordination. We could help you with that, Peterson added, his hand sliding across the table toward hers with deliberate slowness. Show you how things really work. Around here, teach you what you need to know to fit in with the right crowd. The offer was wrapped in false benevolence, but Sarah recognized the predatory psychology underneath. They were offering protection while simultaneously being the source of threat, creating artificial dependency through manufactured fear. It was a technique used by abusers throughout history, from schoolyard bullies to enemy interrogators. I appreciate the offer, Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying exactly the right mixture of gratitude and terror. But I should really get back to my quarters. I have an early morning tomorrow, and I wouldn't want to keep you from your weekend plans. She started to rise, but Thompson's massive hand landed on her shoulder with enough pressure to make her wince. The contact was a clear escalation from psychological to physical intimidation, and Sarah felt the familiar cold anger that had carried her through the most dangerous missions of her career. Your quarters can wait, Thompson's voice rumbled, like distant thunder. We're trying to be nice here, Martinez. You don't want to make us think you don't appreciate our friendship. Rodriguez chuckled, the sound carrying no warmth whatsoever. Yeah, we don't offer this kind of personal attention to just anyone. You should feel special that we've taken such an interest in your development. Jenkins held up his phone, ostensibly checking messages, but actually positioning the camera to capture whatever was about to unfold. Smile for the camera, Sarah. This is going to be educational for everyone. Sarah tried to stand again, but Thompson's grip tightened, his fingers finding nerve clusters with the precision of someone who'd practiced this technique before. Peterson's hand covered hers on the table, his thumb tracing across her knuckles, in a gesture that made her fight every instinct to break his wrist. "Here's how this is going to work." Peterson's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but in the nearly empty mess hall, every word carried clearly. "You're going to come with us to Building 47, just like we discussed. We'll show you some places on base that aren't in the official tour guide. Help you understand the real chain of command around here." Carter leaned forward for the first time, his bored expression replaced by something much more dangerous. "Unless you'd prefer we have this conversation with Commander Hayes instead. Might be interesting to discuss your performance issues with someone who has the authority to end your naval career before it really gets started." The threat was crystal clear. Now submit to whatever they had planned or face professional destruction through fabricated accusations and false reports. Sarah had seen the same technique used in war zones, where enemy forces would threaten civilians' families to ensure compliance with their demands. "Please," Sarah whispered, and for the first time, she didn't have to fake the emotion in her voice, not because she was afraid of what they might do to Sarah Martinez, but because she was genuinely angry about what they had already done to their previous victims. "I don't want any trouble." "No trouble at all." Rodriguez's breath was hot against her ear as he leaned closer. "Just a friendly welcome to the team. Unless you'd prefer we welcome you the hard way." That's when Sarah felt Peterson's grip on her wrist shift from restraint to deliberate pain, his fingers seeking pressure points with the clear intent to cause maximum discomfort without leaving visible bruises. Thompson's hand moved from her shoulder to the back of her neck, his thumb pressing against nerve clusters that could cause unconsciousness if properly applied. Rodriguez's hand slid onto her thigh, the contact a clear sexual assault that crossed every line of military conduct and human decency. Sarah looked around the mess hall one final time. The last two tables of diners were gathering their belongings to leave. No security cameras covered this particular corner she'd checked 3 days ago. No witnesses who would be willing to testify against 5 popular recruits to protect one failing logistics officer. It was exactly the scenario they'd created for their previous victims, and Sarah realized with crystalline clarity that this was the moment when those other women had been forced to make an impossible choice between immediate physical harm and long-term psychological destruction. But Sarah Martinez had never actually existed, and Lieutenant Sarah Storm Martinez had spent 8 years learning that impossible choices were simply problems that required unconventional solutions. She made her decision. The transformation began in Sarah's eyes. For 2 weeks, they had reflected uncertainty, fear, and the desperate vulnerability of someone drowning in an environment too hostile to navigate. But now, in the space of a single heartbeat, they became something else entirely. The fear didn't disappear, it crystallized into a cold, calculating fury that had been forged in the mountains of Afghanistan and tempered in the black waters off the coast of Somalia. "All right," Sarah said quietly, her voice dropping to a register that Peterson's subconscious recognized as dangerous even before his conscious mind could process the change. "I think we're done here." The shift was so sudden and complete that all 5 recruits experienced a moment of cognitive dissonance, their brains struggling to reconcile the terrified logistics officer they'd been tormenting with the predator who had just taken her place. Peterson's grip on her wrist loosened slightly as confusion flickered across his face, and that hesitation became the first domino in a sequence that would redefine their understanding of power, violence, and consequence. Sarah's left hand moved with the fluid precision of someone who had spent 8 years practicing the same motion until it became as natural as breathing. Her fingers wrapped around Peterson's wrist in a grip that felt deceptively gentle for exactly 0.3 seconds, long enough for him to register surprise, but not long enough for him to react. Then she twisted. The sound of small bones separating in Peterson's hand was audible across the nearly empty mess hall, a wet crack that spoke of structural damage that would require months to heal properly. Peterson's face contorted in an expression of pure agony as she applied a joint lock that had been specifically designed to incapacitate larger opponents while minimizing the risk of permanent injury. Before Peterson's scream could fully form in his throat, Sarah was already pivoting to address the secondary threat. Thompson's massive frame had been positioned behind her chair to serve as both intimidation and physical barrier. But his size became a liability when Sarah's right elbow snapped backward with the precision of a piston. The strike landed exactly where her anatomy training had taught her it would have maximum effect: the solar plexus, that cluster of nerve endings that controlled involuntary breathing responses. Thompson's diaphragm seized instantly, his body's automatic systems shutting down as his brain struggled to process the trauma. The big man doubled over, his face cycling through shades of red and purple as he fought for air that wouldn't come. His mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but no sound emerged except a thin wheeze that spoke of complete respiratory distress. Rodriguez had been in the process of sliding his hand higher up Sarah's thigh when the violence erupted. Around him, his predatory brain was still processing the sounds of Peterson's agony when Sarah twisted in her chair with the fluid grace of a dancer and the deadly intent of an assassin. Her movement was so economical that an observer might have mistaken it for a simple change of position, until Rodriguez's feet suddenly weren't touching the floor. The sweep that took his legs was textbook special operations, a technique designed to neutralize threats while controlling the direction and force of their fall. Rodriguez's body described a perfect arc through the air before gravity reasserted control, sending him crashing into the adjacent table with enough force to scatter metal trays and plastic chairs across a 10-foot radius, his head connected with the edge of a bench with a sound like a baseball bat hitting a watermelon, and Rodriguez went limp instantly. He wasn't dead. Sarah had controlled the angle to avoid lethal trauma, but he would remain unconscious for the next several hours and wake up with a concussion that would leave him questioning his life choices for weeks to come. Jenkins had been documenting everything through his phone's camera, probably planning to use the footage for blackmail, or simply to relive the experience of dominating someone weaker. But when the violence exploded around him, his hands began shaking so badly that the phone became a liability rather than a tool. He fumbled with the device, trying to call for help or perhaps delete the evidence of their assault. But Sarah's left hand clamped over his wrist with enough pressure to make his fingers go numb. The joint manipulation she applied was more subtle than the one she'd used on Peterson, but no less effective. Jenkins felt the small bones in his wrist shift in directions they were never meant to go, and his phone clattered to the floor as his hand opened involuntarily. Sarah used his own momentum to guide him into a controlled fall that sent him sprawling across two overturned chairs, his shoulder connecting with hard plastic at an angle that would leave him unable to lift his arm above his head for the next month. Carter, who had maintained his position near the exit throughout the assault, demonstrated the survival instinct that had kept him alive longer than his companions. As Sarah's cold gaze settled on him, he raised both hands in the universal gesture of surrender and backed slowly away from the carnage. "Smart choice," Sarah said conversationally, her breathing barely elevated despite having incapacitated 4 grown men in the span of 28 seconds. A mess hall had become a tableau of controlled violence and swift justice. Peterson knelt on the floor, cradling his broken wrist against his chest while tears of pain streamed down his face. Thompson remained doubled over, still fighting for each breath as his diaphragm slowly remembered how to function. Rodriguez lay motionless among the scattered debris of the table he'd destroyed, blood trickling from a scalp wound that looked worse than it was. Jenkins writhed on the floor, clutching his dislocated shoulder while staring at Sarah with an expression of absolute terror. The entire encounter had taken exactly 28 seconds from the moment Sarah decided to drop her cover until Carter's surrender. 28 seconds to transform from victim to victor, to redefine the power dynamic that had controlled this space for months, and to demonstrate that assumptions about strength and weakness could be lethally incorrect. Sarah straightened her uniform with the same casual precision she'd used to destroy her attackers, then walked calmly back to her table to collect her belongings. She stepped over Rodriguez's unconscious form as if he were a piece of furniture that someone had inconsiderately left in her path. "The next time you think about putting your hands on someone without permission," she said in a voice that carried clearly across the devastated mess hall, "you might want to make sure you know who you're dealing with first." The surviving members of Peterson's crew, though still conscious enough to process her words, would remember that advice for the rest of their military careers, however long those careers might last after tonight's revelations came to light. But the lesson was about to become much more comprehensive, because Sarah Martinez wasn't finished with her demonstration. The silence that followed the violence was more terrifying than the sounds of combat had been. Peterson's labored breathing, mixed with Thompson's desperate wheezing, created a symphony of defeat that echoed off the mess hall's institutional walls. Jenkins's quiet whimpering provided counterpoint to the steady drip of blood from Rodriguez's motionless form. Carter remained frozen near the exit, his hands still raised, his mind struggling to process what he'd just witnessed. Sarah reached into her uniform pocket with the same casual precision she'd used to dismantle their assault, her movements deliberate and unhurried. The leather credential case she withdrew was regulation black, worn smooth by years of use and completely unremarkable except for the weight of authority it represented. She let it fall open in her palm, the gold badge catching the harsh fluorescent lighting as she held it where Peterson could see it through his tears of pain and shock. "Lieutenant Sarah Martinez," she said in a voice that carried the calm authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Naval Special Warfare Development Group, SEAL Team 6. Peterson's face underwent a transformation that would have been comical under different circumstances. The arrogant confidence that had defined his features for the past 2 weeks drained away like water from a broken dam, replaced by the pale horror of someone realizing they'd just attempted to sexually assault one of the most elite warriors in the United States military. "Oh shit," he whispered, his voice cracking like an adolescent's. "Oh shit, oh shit, oh shit, ... Thompson managed to draw enough air to look up from his doubled-over position, his eyes focusing on the credentials, with the slow comprehension of someone whose brain was still oxygen-deprived. When the realization hit him, he actually tried to back away while still kneeling, his body instinctively recognizing a predator far more dangerous than anything he'd ever encountered. "The past 2 weeks have been very educational," Sarah continued, returning her credentials to her pocket while keeping her voice conversational, as if she were discussing the weather rather than the systematic destruction of a sexual assault. "Ring, I have detailed reports of your behavioral patterns, documented evidence of your victim selection process, sworn statements from 3 previous targets, and as of 30 seconds ago, video evidence of assault, battery, and attempted sexual assault." She gestured toward the corner of the mess hall, where a security camera had been discreetly installed exactly 72 hours earlier. Its red recording light had been blinking steadily throughout the entire encounter, capturing every moment. From Peterson's initial approach to Carter's current surrender posture, Jenkins tried to sit up, his face contorting with pain as his dislocated shoulder reminded him of his new limitations. "You single quotes re ... You're a SEAL?" His voice carried the hollow disbelief of someone whose entire worldview had just collapsed. "Naval Special Warfare Development Group, actually," Sarah corrected with clinical precision. "We're what SEALs become when they grow up." Did you really think the Navy would send an untrained logistics officer to deal with a problem like you? She pulled out her encrypted phone and speed dialed a number that connected directly to base security. The conversation was brief and professional, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone who expected immediate compliance. Base security, this is Lieutenant Martinez. I have 5 personnel requiring medical attention and immediate detention. In the main mess hall, charges include conspiracy, assault with intent to commit bodily harm, sexual battery, and conduct unbecoming of naval personnel. Yes, sir. Operation Mousetrap is complete. Estimated time to your arrival? As she spoke, Rodriguez began to stir, consciousness returning in slow waves that brought awareness of pain and a growing confusion about his surroundings. Sarah knelt beside him with the professional concern of someone trained in battlefield medicine, her fingers checking his pulse while her eyes monitored his pupil responses. Stay down, she said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of authority that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to survival instincts. Move too quickly, and I'll assume you're still a threat. Trust me when I tell you that you don't. Want to find out what happens then? Rodriguez's eyes focused on her face with growing horror as memories of the past few minutes began to reassemble themselves into a coherent narrative. The predatory confidence he'd worn like armor for months crumbled as he realized he was looking into the eyes of someone who could end his life with casual efficiency. The sound of boots on linoleum announced the arrival of base security. Master Chief Petty Officer Williams burst through the mess hall doors with 4 armed security personnel, their weapons drawn and ready for whatever threat had prompted a priority response call from Naval Special Warfare. Stand down, Master Chief, Sarah called out calmly, not bothering to turn around as she continued monitoring Rodriguez's condition. Situation is contained. Suspects are disabled and no longer pose a threat to anyone except possibly themselves. Williams surveyed the devastation with the experienced eye of someone who'd spent 30 years dealing with military crisis. Overturned tables, scattered chairs, broken dishes, and 5 young men in various states of physical and psychological distress painted a clear picture of violence efficiently applied. Jesus Christ, Lieutenant, he said with genuine admiration. What did you do to them? I introduced them to the concept of consequences, Sarah replied, finally standing and brushing imaginary dust from her uniform. Mr. Peterson discovered that grabbing someone without permission can be hazardous to his skeletal structure. Mr. Thompson learned that intimidation tactics work both ways. Mr. Rodriguez found out that unconsciousness is an effective cure for overconfidence. Mr. Jenkins realized that documenting assault can become evidence for prosecution rather than blackmail. She looked at Carter, who remained frozen in his surrender position near the exit. Mr. Carter demonstrated the wisdom of knowing when to quit while he was behind. Williams began directing his team to secure the scene and provide medical attention to the injured. What about charges, Lieutenant? Sarah handed him a thick manila folder that materialized from her jacket with the efficiency of a magician's trick. Complete documentation of a 2-week undercover operation. Video evidence. Written statements, medical records from previous victims, and psychological profiles establishing pattern behavior. The JAG's office should have everything they need for courts-martial proceedings. Peterson tried to speak, his voice a hoarse whisper barely audible over the growing activity around them. We didn't know we didn't know who you were. Sarah looked down at him with the cold assessment of a professional evaluating a failed opponent. That's exactly the point, Mr. Peterson. You never know who you're looking at when you decide to become a predator. The quiet woman in the corner could be someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's mother. She could also be someone who spent 8 years learning how to kill people with her bare hands. She straightened her uniform one final time and walked toward the exit, stepping carefully around the debris field that had once been Peterson's criminal enterprise. "The scariest thing about monsters," she said without looking back, "is that sometimes they look exactly like the people who are supposed to stop them." As the mess hall filled with medical personnel and military police, 5 young men began to understand that their reign of terror had ended not with external intervention, but with their own catastrophic miscalculation about the nature of strength, weakness, and the women who serve their country. The wheels of military justice moved with the precision of a Swiss chronometer once. Lieutenant Sarah Martinez's evidence reached the Judge Advocate General's office. What had taken Peterson's crew months to construct through intimidation and systematic abuse unraveled in a matter of days under the scrutiny of legal professionals who specialized in prosecuting military crimes. Captain Jennifer Walsh, the senior JAG officer assigned to the case, had seen every variety of misconduct in her 15-year career, but the documentation from Operation Nostrap impressed even her seasoned perspective. The evidence files read, like a masterclass in criminal investigation psychological profiles, behavioral pattern analysis, victim impact statements, and video evidence so comprehensive that defense attorneys would have little room to maneuver. "I've never seen anything this thorough from an undercover operation," Captain Walsh told Commander Hayes during their initial briefing. "Your Lieutenant Martinez didn't just catch them in the act. She built a prosecutorial roadmap that could convict them in civilian court, much less a court-martial." The legal proceedings began within 72 hours of the mess hall incident. Peterson, his wrist still in a cast that would remain for the next 6 weeks, faced the most serious charges. Article 120 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice Sexual assault carried a maximum sentence of life imprisonment. Combined with conspiracy charges, conduct unbecoming an officer, and aggravated assault, he was looking at decades behind bars and a dishonorable discharge that would follow him for the rest of his civilian life. Rodriguez, who had regained consciousness in the base hospital with a concussion that left him nauseated for days, discovered that his crude comments and physical aggression had been carefully documented by multiple witnesses. The video evidence showed him placing his hand on Sarah's thigh without consent, transforming what might have been dismissed as boys being boys into federal sexual battery charges. Thompson's case proved more complex. His role as physical intimidator made him complicit in the conspiracy, but his cooperation with investigators and obvious remorse earned him consideration for a plea agreement. The massive recruit spent hours in the JAG's office, his voice barely above a whisper, as he detailed the group's methodology and identified other potential victims who had never filed formal complaints. "I never wanted to hurt anyone," he insisted. During one recorded interview, his hands shaking as he described Peterson's escalating demands for loyalty. "I just wanted to fit in, you know?" Peterson made it sound like this was normal, like everyone did this kind of stuff. I was stupid enough to believe him. Jenkins presented the most legally interesting case because his phone had captured evidence of multiple assaults over the past several months. The device, seized immediately after the mess hall incident, contained videos and photos that had been intended for blackmail, but instead became a prosecutor's dream. Each file represented additional charges, additional victims, and additional proof of the systematic nature of their criminal enterprise. Carter's cooperation proved instrumental in understanding the full scope of their activities. His detailed testimony revealed a network that extended beyond the 5 core members, involving other personnel who had provided information about potential targets, created alibis for the assault team, and helped maintain the climate of fear that kept victims silent. The revelation that shocked even experienced investigators was the discovery of a shared digital folder containing photographs and videos of 17 different women, most of whom had never reported being victimized. The files were organized with clinical efficiency names, schedules, psychological profiles, and detailed plans for recruitment that read like predatory instruction manuals. 3 weeks after the mess hall confrontation, the first court-martial convened in a courtroom that buzzed with tension and anticipation. Word of the case had spread throughout the naval community, and the proceedings drew observers from multiple commands who wanted to witness justice being served against predators who had terrorized their colleagues. Lieutenant Sarah Martinez took the witness stand wearing her dress blue uniform with a Navy and Marine Corps Achievement Medal, Combat Action Ribbon, and the coveted Special Warfare insignia that immediately identified her credentials to everyone. In the courtroom, her testimony was delivered with the same calm professionalism she'd demonstrated during the confrontation itself. The defendants established a pattern of behavior designed to identify, isolate, and victimize female personnel they perceived as vulnerable. She testified under direct examination. Their methodology showed sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation, suggesting this was not impulsive behavior, but rather a coordinated criminal enterprise. Defense attorneys attempted to argue that their clients had been entrapped by an undercover operation, but Captain Walsh demolished that argument with surgical precision. Lieutenant Martinez did nothing more than present herself as a potential victim, Walsh stated during closing arguments. She did not encourage, suggest, or facilitate any criminal behavior. The defendants chose their actions based on their own predatory instincts and established patterns of abuse. The fact that they selected a trained Navy SEAL as their target demonstrates the random, opportunistic nature of their crimes. The verdicts came down like hammer blows over the course of a week. Peterson received the maximum sentence, 25 years imprisonment, reduction to E1, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, and a dishonorable discharge. The judge's statement during sentencing left no doubt about the court's perspective on his crimes. You violated the trust placed in you as a leader, betrayed your oath to protect those who serve alongside you, and caused immeasurable harm to the victims and the naval service, Judge Captain Morrison declared. Your actions were not those of a sailor, but of a predator who used military structure to enable criminal behavior. Rodriguez received 15 years. Thompson got 8 years. With a plea agreement, and Jenkins faced 12 years plus registration as a sex offender. Carter's cooperation earned him a reduction to 5 years, but his naval career was finished. The ripple effects extended far beyond the individual sentences. 7 other personnel received non-judicial punishment for their roles in maintaining the climate of silence. 2 junior officers faced administrative separation for failing to report suspected misconduct. The entire training command underwent restructuring with new oversight protocols and mandatory reporting procedures. But perhaps the most significant change was atmospheric. The culture of fear that had dominated certain areas of the base evaporated. Almost overnight, female personnel began walking with their heads up, making eye contact, speaking with confidence that hadn't existed for months. Petty Officer Second Class Maria Santos, one of the original complainants whose case had initiated the investigation, summarized the transformation during a follow-up interview. For the first time in over a year, I don't look over my shoulder when I walk across the base, she said. I don't avoid certain areas or certain people. I feel like I can focus on being a sailor instead of constantly trying to avoid becoming a victim. The broader naval community took notice as well. Operation Mousetrap became a case study taught at naval academies and leadership schools, illustrating both the danger of toxic cultures and the effectiveness of professional intervention when properly applied. As the legal proceedings concluded, Sarah Martinez prepared for her next assignment, knowing that somewhere else in the military, other predators were operating under the assumption that rank, group dynamics, and institutional silence would protect them from consequences. They were about to learn how wrong that assumption could be. 6 months after the mess hall incident that would become legend throughout the naval community, Lieutenant Sarah "Storm" Martinez stood at the edge of Naval Base Coronado's main pier, watching the sunrise paint the Pacific Ocean in shades of gold and crimson. The early morning air carried the familiar scent of salt spray and diesel fuel that had become the backdrop for one of the most successful undercover operations in recent military history. Behind her, the base hummed with the controlled energy of a military installation that had undergone fundamental transformation. New protocols governed every aspect of personnel interaction. Mandatory respect and dignity training was now woven into the fabric of basic orientation, not as an afterthought, but as a core component of military professionalism. Most importantly, the culture of silence that had protected predators for years had been replaced by an environment where victims could report abuse without fear of retaliation or disbelief. The changes extended far beyond policy documents and training schedules. Sarah had watched the base's social dynamics evolve in real time, observing how the removal of Peterson's toxic influence had allowed healthier leadership structures to emerge. Female personnel moved with confidence that hadn't existed before Operation Mousetrap. Conversations in mess halls and barracks no longer carried undercurrents of fear or intimidation. The very air seemed lighter, as if an oppressive weight had been lifted from thousands of shoulders. Commander Hayes approached from the administration building, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of a commanding officer whose unit had become a model for the rest of the fleet. The transformation had not gone unnoticed by higher authorities. Naval Base Coronado had received official commendation for its handling of the crisis and subsequent implementation of preventive measures. Final numbers came in yesterday, Hayes said, handing Sarah one of the cups. 23 additional victims came forward after the story broke. Some of these cases dated back 3 years. Your operation didn't just stop Peterson's crew, it cracked open a culture of systematic abuse that had been festering since before any of us knew it existed. Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully, her eyes still focused on the horizon, where morning patrol boats were beginning their daily security runs. The most important number isn't how many came forward, she replied quietly. It's how many won't have to become victims because those predators are no longer hunting. The ripple effects had extended throughout the entire naval community. The story of the logistics officer who turned out to be a Navy SEAL had spread through official and unofficial channels, becoming a cautionary tale that circulated in recruit training facilities, officer candidate schools, and operational units around the world. The psychological impact was precisely what Sarah had hoped for. Predators now had to consider the possibility that their next target might be someone far more dangerous than she appeared. The Naval Academy is using your operation as a case study in their leadership ethics course, Hayes continued. They're calling it the Mousetrap Doctrine, the principle that leaders must create environments where predators cannot operate, regardless of rank, popularity, or perceived immunity. Sarah smiled at the designation, remembering her grandfather's stories about mousetraps on the family farm in Texas. Simple devices that worked precisely because their targets underestimated the danger until it was too late. The metaphor was more appropriate than the instructors probably realized. 3 months earlier, she had received a handwritten letter from Petty Officer Second Class Maria Santos, one of the original complainants whose courage had initiated the investigation. The letter, now framed in Sarah's quarters, contained words that meant more than any medal or commendation could ever convey. Lieutenant Martinez, it began, I wanted to thank you for giving me back my voice. For 2 years, I felt like I was disappearing a little bit every day. Peterson and his crew made me question my worth, my capabilities, and my right to serve my country. When I watch female recruits now, I see confidence that wasn't there before. They walk like soldiers, not like victims. They speak up in training, volunteer for assignments, and hold their heads high because they know someone will listen if they need help. You didn't just stop 5 predators. You saved countless women who will never have to experience what we went through. The letter concluded with news that Santos had been accepted for officer candidate school, her performance evaluations having improved dramatically once she was free from the psychological burden of constant vigilance against assault. Similar stories arrived regularly in Sarah's official correspondence. Thompson, whose cooperation had been instrumental in the prosecutions, had written from the military correctional facility where he was serving his sentence. His letter described participation in rehabilitation programs and expressed genuine remorse for his actions. But more importantly, it detailed his efforts to educate other inmates about the psychological damage caused by sexual assault and intimidation. Even more significant were the systemic changes that had emerged from the legal proceedings. The Pentagon had implemented new protocols for investigating harassment complaints, including mandatory outside review when local commands failed to take appropriate action. Training programs developed at Coronado were being deployed fleet-wide, and Sarah's undercover methodology had become a template for addressing similar problems at other installations. The professional recognition was gratifying, but Sarah found deeper satisfaction in smaller moments that spoke to genuine cultural transformation. Yesterday, she had observed a group of female recruits correcting the inappropriate behavior of male personnel without fear of consequences. Last week, she had watched a junior officer report suspected harassment by a superior, confident that the system would protect rather than punish her for speaking up. As she prepared for her next assignment, the details remained classified, but it involved similar work in a different branch of the military. Sarah reflected on the psychological cost of spending 2 weeks projecting weakness and vulnerability. The experience had reminded her why she had chosen this career path, to stand between those who would abuse power and those who deserved protection. Her encrypted phone buzzed with an incoming message from her new commanding officer, containing coordinates and a brief mission summary that made her smile grimly. Somewhere in the Army's Special Forces training pipeline, female soldiers were reporting systematic harassment by instructors who believed their positions made them untouchable. They were about to discover how wrong that assumption could be. Sarah finished her coffee and walked back toward the base administration building, already beginning the mental transformation that would turn her into whatever persona the next mission required. Behind her, the sun climbed higher over naval. Base Coronado, illuminating an installation where predators no longer hunted in safety and where the words, "Don't mess with the quiet ones," had become more than just barracks folklore. The legend of the 32nd Mess Hall incident would outlive her time at Coronado, passed down through generations of military personnel as a reminder that strength often comes in unexpected packages. Some lessons Sarah knew were worth teaching more than once. Somewhere out there, good people needed someone to watch their backs. And Lieutenant Sarah Storm Martinez had learned long ago that sometimes the most important battles weren't fought in foreign countries against foreign enemies, but in mess halls and training facilities against those who wore the same uniform while betraying everything it was supposed to represent. The next hunt was about to begin.